Hey everyone, this is Libertarian Black Man. The wealth gap between the 1% and 99% is certainly becoming a hotter topic as we go into the 2020 presidential election. If you were to listen to the leading voices in the progressive community, Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren, who both are expected to announce that they're running for president very shortly, you would believe that the wealth gap between the 1% and 99% is being widened by tax cuts for the wealthy, low wages for workers, and corporate greed. All three of these ideas are 100% wrong. In fact, the reason the wealth gap is widening so much is because of monetary and banking policies, specifically the creation of inflation. And inflation is created by creating money from nothing through either the printing press or through revaluation, which is just taking, say, a $100 bill and adding a zero onto it so that it is worth $1,000, or by writing digits into accounts. That's the way that banks create inflation, by writing digits into accounts so that they have more money to lend than they actually have. So the federal government and Federal Reserve, which is the Central Bank of America, creates the inflation. The inflation then flows into stock, real estate, and commodity assets. And it is the owner of those assets who are made artificially wealthier by the inflation. Now, who owns those assets? It is the wealthiest Americans when it comes to stocks. The richest 10% of them own 84% of all the stocks. So when you see the stock market going up by double, triple, quadruple, that money is going to the wealthy because they own almost all of the stocks. If you look at the land, the wealthy own much of the land, most of the land. If you look at just the top 10 wealthiest landowners, they own the equivalent of 0.5% of all the land in America, which is huge. 10 people own 0.5% of all of the land in the United States, 13 million acres. So when you see real estate values going up, keep in mind that most of that money is going to the wealthy. So how is inflation created? The federal government prints the money and sends it to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then sends the money to the banks through low interest rate loans through something called the discount rate. The Federal Reserve also allows banks to lend to each other at low interest rates it's something called the federal funds rate that the Federal Reserve sets for banks when they lend to each other. The Federal Reserve also allows banks to create money out of nothing through fractional reserve lending, which I will talk more about in future videos, but it is a way that banks create money without printing it. They just type in numbers into accounts and make that money available for withdrawal or for lending. Now, what recessions do is they fight wealth disparities because they eliminate inflation through deflation. When the money supply expands and prices rise, that's inflation. When the money supply contracts, prices fall, that's deflation. So recessions are the main reason why the wealth gap closes, and then inflation is the reason why the wealth gap widens. This is a chart of what the income of Americans has done over the past 40 years. The top line, the top jagged line here, is the top 1% of Americans and their household income. The three lines at the bottom represent the income of the bottom 99% of Americans. And what you notice is that the wealth of the top 1% fluctuates more in line with economic expansions and contractions than it does for the bottom 99%. So, for example, you see this huge upswing in the wealth of the top 1% during the 1990s. Notice during that same period, the wealth of the bottom 99% stayed mostly flat by comparison. as the wealth of the top 1% goes up, the gap, which is this open space here between the top line and the bottom lines, this gap widens as the wealth of the top 1% goes up. So when there's a recession, you can tell when there's a recession because the wealth of the top 1% will begin to dive south. As in this case, this is the recession of the early 2000s. The wealth of the top 1% began to dive down, while the wealth of the bottom 99% stayed flat. Then the 2000s, we start to see the housing boom and the real estate boom. The top 1% saw its wealth go up dramatically. The bottom 99% saw its wealth stay constant. The wealth gap between the 1% and 99% has never been this big in the past 40 years. And it has everything to do with the wealthy getting wealthier from the inflation created by the government and the Fed. And then the recession hits. Look at what happens. A big decrease in the wealth gap. The wealth gap closes not because the bottom 99% are losing money, but the top 1% is losing money. And as a result, their wealth is being brought down because stocks are losing value, real estate is losing value, commodities are losing value, and so their wealth is more, the gap between the top 1% and 99% has closed. And of course, the Federal Reserve and federal government create inflation to fight the recession. That inflation goes to the wealthy, and the value of their income begins to rise again, while the bottom 99% is left flat where it was before. So this is just an example of what happened with the stock market. This is the Dow Jones Industrial Index, and this is the peak in 2007 of the stock market, and it lost 50% of its value over the next year and a half. So the wealthy, being the main owners of the stocks, saw their values cut down by more than half during this time period. But the federal government and the Federal Reserve created inflation and sent the stock market going up for the next 8-9 years. There are people who are middle class and who are even lower class who own some of these stocks, but the vast majority are owned by the wealthy, and when the stock market soars, most of that money is going to the wealthy and making the wealth gap worse. The same is true for housing. This is a measurement of home values, the Case-Shiller National Home Price Index. During the 1990s, we see a big increase in home values, and then home values peak in 2006 and 7. The recession hits, home values are deflated, and then with inflation created by the government and central bank, home values begin rising again, and they hit record levels again in 2017 and 18. So the wealthy own most of the real estate, the homes, the commercial properties, and the land out, just open land. As a result, they benefit from the appreciation of land values, but they also suffer the greatest loss when there's a recession and land values are falling downward. So Jeff Bezos is a perfect example of a wealthy person who has benefited greatly from the inflation of the Federal Reserve and federal government. He owns 16% of Amazon. The stock of Amazon stayed below $200 a share for the first 15 years of existence. Then the recession hits in 2007 and 8 and 9. The central planners created inflation to fight the Great Recession between 2008 and 2014, and the inflation went into Amazon stock, so much so that the price went up 10 times, from $200 to $2,000 a share between 2012 and 2018, making Jeff Bezos the world's richest man. Had he owned the entire business, he would have been a trillionaire by 2018 because Amazon's value went all the way to $1 trillion as a result of inflation created by the federal government and Federal Reserve, putting money into circulation, and then people borrow that money and buy Amazon stock. They send the stock price soaring, and it goes right into the net worth of whoever owns that stock. And this is a graphic, this is a graphic visual of the Amazon stock during from the mid-90s to the early 2000s, early 2010s. The price stayed basically flat, and then we get into 2014 and we start to see Amazon's price go through the moon. Right here at the top, Jeff Bezos is the world's richest man because of all the inflation created. But since then, the Federal Reserve has begun pulling money out of the banking system. And so we're seeing a contraction. They've raised interest rates and they've pulled out money that they've loaned into the banking system to stop the recession. Now we're seeing Amazon's price fall because the inflation is turning into deflation. And so Jeff Bezos has lost tens of billions of dollars as a result, but he's still the world's richest man. But if this trend continues, the wealth gap will certainly reflect the fact that we are in a recession and that the money supply is contracting. So what should we do about the wealth disparity between the 1% and 99%? There are good ideas and bad ideas. The bad ideas are the ones you're hearing from Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and other leading progressives, which include raising taxes on the 1%. All that does is drive investment away from the United States. You see the wealthy putting their money offshore. You see them creating fewer jobs, investing less in production in the country, and that slows down the entire growth rate of the economy. Raising the minimum wage. Bernie Sanders is calling for the minimum wage to be more than doubled from $7.25 an hour to $15. That would kill jobs, it would raise prices, it would hurt the ability of the poor to obtain wealth and help get themselves out of the economic situation they're in. Increasing regulations on corporations. It's the same thing. It would have the same effect that raising taxes or raising minimum wages would have, which would hurt investment, hurt job creation, hurt economic productivity and growth, and ultimately make the wealth gap wider. Then stimulating the economy with corporate bailouts and welfare subsidies. You're just pumping up the value of the net worth of the wealthy when you do that, as we just showed. When inflation is created, it goes to the wealthy because it goes into assets owned by the wealthy, and the wealth gap gets wider. Good ideas to decrease the wealth gap. Cut taxes on the 100% of Americans. Rich, poor, middle class, it shouldn't matter. Everyone should get a tax cut. Abolish the minimum wage and corporate subsidies and welfare programs, because these things just go into the hands of the wealthy as far as corporate subsidies, and make it more difficult for the poor because it results in higher taxes. Every time there's a program created by government, you have to raise taxes to fund the program. That comes from the poor. When you raise the minimum wage, you just make the poor more expensive to employ. Fewer of them get employed, and you end up with more poverty and a wider wealth gap. But the biggest way to reduce the wealth gap is to end inflation and bailouts by the government and banking system, which is why I have that underlined. Inflation and bailouts inevitably go to the wealthy, as we've seen over the last decade. It makes the wealthy artificially wealthier and makes the wealth gap larger because, as we've shown, the 99% don't see much of a fluctuation in their wealth, but the top 1% sees a great fluctuation, and when there's inflation being created, they get all of that money and the wealth gap widens. You're never going to eliminate the wealth gap in a free country, but you can keep it from becoming artificially larger than it ever should be by ending bad monetary and banking policies of the authorities in charge of the money supply. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel Libertarian Black Man and follow us on Twitter at Libertarian Black Man. Please purchase the book Say No to Big Government, My Case for Maximum Freedom on Amazon for $18, and we hope to see you in the next video.